Hi everyone, welcome to your third at-home chapter preview video. Make sure that you've got your guided notes with you. These are basically a study guide for the whole chapter. So if you don't have them, press pause and go grab them. All right, as usual, we're going to start with a refresher on the purposes of these videos. Normally I tell you two purposes. One is to contextualize and the other is to preview new information. But today we're going to add a third purpose to help you become familiar with one particular historical skill that we abbreviate CCOT, or change in continuity over time. So chapter 15 is very much a political history chapter on the developments of absolutism and constitutionalism. We can contextualize those two new developments in this previous age of religious warfare, which we saw created very unique political challenges and turmoil across Europe. In fact, we already looked closely at the case of the French religious wars, in which this destruction and decentralization eventually led to more centralization. But in the context of this turmoil that's rooted in the Reformation, monarchs did find a particular need to politically recover and rebuild. So the video is also going to preview the two main approaches to this political recovery and rebuilding, the new political theories of absolutism and constitutionalism. Both are going to be defined for you, and you'll also learn the basic theories and practices of each. This period of political recovery and rebuilding lasted from about 1648 to 1763, but it represents both continuities and changes from the previous era, 1453 to 1648. We've moved beyond this trifecta of the Age of Exploration, the Renaissance, and the Reformation, but a lot of the patterns established in that period are going to continue. Namely, this era is very much about a continuation of the centralization of state power in the hands of monarchies. The state-building goals and techniques of absolute monarchs are very similar to new monarchs in trying to reduce the power of the church and the nobility, while continuing to gain profitable territory and overseas trade. However, some of those state-building methods will change. Newer economic policies replaced older ones, and now culture and science are going to be used explicitly to gain power. Absolute monarchs had an unprecedented amount of authority over the government and their subjects. But perhaps the greatest change would be the coming of an entirely new type of political structure known as constitutionalism. But before we define and discuss those new political theories and practices, absolutism and constitutionalism, let's just take a bit more time to understand the contextualization of this chapter. There is one very good case study of a religious war that we haven't talked about yet, and that conflict is really the backdrop of all new methods of state building between 1648 and 1763. That conflict is the 30 Years' War, and it's one of the many wars of religion between 1588 and 1648. We've actually already looked at some others. For example, the Peasants' War under Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire, and then later the Dutch revolts under his son King Philip of Spain. Speaking of Spain, there was also the Spanish Armada, or the attempted invasion of England for their converting to the Anglican faith. And finally, we looked at the domestic conflicts during the French religious wars, namely the War of the Three Henries. So you might realize that all these wars, there's more to them than just religion. Yes, in part they can be defined by a fight between Catholics and Protestants for control over people's souls, but they were also wars about domestic and international politics. The Dutch revolted against Spain, not only because they were Calvinists while the Spanish were fervent Catholics, but because they wanted to be economically free from the Habsburg Empire. Of course, the Spanish needed the great Dutch wealth to support their state, so they resisted their independence with the Council of Blood. Elizabeth I of England supported the Dutch in their revolts, not only because they were also Protestant, but because the English had political interests in bringing down Spanish economic power. Therefore, Philip II sent the Armada to England not only to reconvert them to Catholicism, but also to defend the Spanish international empire from English threats. So I want to take a quick look at this very famous sort of political cartoon image, and it's an image of a Dutch milk cow, and the cow represents the great wealth of the Dutch Low Countries. And we can pull out all these players and their role in this international struggle to control Dutch wealth. So the first is Philip II, and he's riding the milk cow, trying to control it and sort of beating it up, trying to keep it under his control. And then we've also got Elizabeth I, who's feeding the milk cow. She was sending supplies, weapons, and money to the Dutch to support their revolt against the Spanish. And we've got two other figures here. We've got a French duke, the Duke of Anjou. He's the son of the French king. And he's also trying to invade the Netherlands at the time. And actually, for a brief amount of time, the French did control parts of the Netherlands. It's not easy to see in this image, but the cow is actually defecating on the Duke of Anjou, which is a symbol of the cow rejecting French control. They never really did a good job controlling the Netherlands. And then finally, we've got a figure we haven't talked about yet. His name is William of Orange, and he's the leader of the Dutch revolts against the Spanish. And he's got his hands on the cow's horns, also trying to control it in another way. So I just love this image because it really encapsulates all of the religious wars of the Reformation in this one single image surrounding the Dutch. And finally, the War of the Three Henries was truly a dynastic civil war that replaced the Valois dynasty with the Bourbons under Henry IV. The same analysis can be applied to the 30 Years' War, which you'll be reading more about this week. The 30 Years' War, lasting from 1618 to 1648, was also a religious war between the Catholic League and the Protestant Union armies. But also, secondly, it was a war about the political balance of power in Europe. Princes were rebelling against their monarchs for independence, and dynasties were grabbing territory to add power to their realms. Political forces, in other words, were taking advantage of religious turmoil to gain power. And thirdly, the 30 Years' War was also an ethnic conflict, particularly in Eastern Europe. The diverse ethnic groups of Eastern Europe tended to convert to Protestantism together, so war about religion there also took on a layer of ethnic tension. These two maps will kind of demonstrate the extent of the 30 Years' War. This one shows the span of the 30 Years' War across the entire European continent. So on top of the domestic wars within France, for example, over religion, the 30 Years' War is an international religious war. And this second map kind of just breaks down Europe by religion after the Reformation. And if you look particularly at Eastern Europe, anything to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, look at Poland, for example, all these striped lines indicate to us that the situation there is particularly complicated, because adding to the complicated divides between Catholics and Protestants was ethnic division there as well. For being all these three things at once and for dragging on for so long, the 30 Years' War was more destructive than any of the above-mentioned religious wars. In fact, it's the most destructive war in Europe until World War I. Therefore, the end of this war with the Peace of Westphalia is a really significant turning point in European history. For one, it does mark the end of religious wars. Never again would a war be justified on religious grounds. Also, it does reorganize political borders and in turn the balance of power between European states. For example, France becomes significantly more powerful while the Holy Roman Empire remained decentralized. The Spanish Habsburgs were also big losers because the treaty recognized the independence of the Netherlands. And finally, it does mark the end of the papacy as an independent political force in Europe. So these two maps will also help you understand the impacts of the Peace of Westphalia. This map is a map of the political borders in Europe around 1500, especially looking at that mess of small independent states that was the Holy Roman Empire. But pay close attention to Eastern Europe and look at this map of Europe in the Peace of Westphalia. So, for the first time, we're really going to have to discuss the history of Eastern Europe in Chapter 15. For its degree of demographic and economic destruction and the political chaos that ensued, the 30 Years' War, more than any other religious war, demanded a reassertion of state power after 1648. Absolutism was generally the most popular answer to these problems. 5 European states became absolute powers in the years following the 30 Years' War. They found the centralization of state power in the hands of the monarch the most effective approach to the problems caused by that war. And those states are France under Louis XIV, who will get our special attention in this unit, Austria, Prussia, Russia, the three Eastern European powers that we have to pay attention to, especially Russia under Peter the Great, and Sweden, who will unfortunately get none of our time except for these few seconds that I'm mentioning it. All five of these powers ruled under a particular type of absolutism known as divine right absolutism. All forms of absolutism, by definition, place absolute power in the hands of the monarch, demanding loyalty to that figure above all else. But the different theories justify this ultimate authority of the monarch for different reasons. Divine right political thinkers believed that absolute power of the monarch was necessary to achieve a world of security and correctness that was aligned with God's law. The power of the absolute monarch came from God, who ruled on earth on behalf of God's will, order, and law. On behalf of God, the absolute ruler was required to care for his subjects and provide them with material and spiritual security. Two French thinkers had particular influence on the development of this political theory, Jean Bodin and Jacques Bossuet. Jean Bodin wrote in his 6 books of the Republic, "Seeing that nothing upon earth is greater or higher next unto God than the majesty of kings and sovereign princes, the principal point of sovereign majesty and absolute power is to consist principally in giving laws unto subjects in general, without their consent." While Jacques Bossuet wrote, "It is one thing for a government to be absolute, and quite another for it to be arbitrary," emphasizing that absolute sovereigns are obligated to rule subject to God's judgment, although no human could judge them. There was an alternative justification for absolute rule proposed, and this second type is secular. Rather than justifying absolute authority from the power of God, secular absolutism justified absolute power simply on the grounds that only a ruler with absolute power could create a secure society where man is so prone to war. Therefore, according to secular absolutism, absolute power was given to a ruler for the purpose of creating state security. The ruler's absolute power came from the consent of the subjects, who enter into a social contract with their ruler. In that agreement, the subjects give up all of their rights to the ruler in exchange for the ruler's protection. And the most famous political thinker behind secular absolutism is Thomas Hobbes, who wrote in his Leviathan, "The only way to erect a common power, as may be able to defend them from the invasion of foreigners and the injuries of one another, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man, or upon an assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices into one will, made by covenant of every man with every man, in such manner as if every man should say to every other man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man, or to this assembly of men, on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner." Notice that in both versions of absolutism, the ruler is obligated to provide for the subjects, although they have no rights whatsoever. In reality, all the successful absolute states opted to use divine right theory. In practice, all absolute states had 4 common characteristics: absolute subordination of the nobility to the monarch, state-serving economic policies, absolute control over religion, and finally the use of science and culture to glorify their absolute rule. We're going to briefly look at each. What defined the specific nature of absolutism in each of the 5 absolute states was the relationship between the ruler and the nobles. Nobles, who, as we've seen, were previously pretty resistant to recognizing the king's authority, became much more accepting of their inferior positions relative to the absolute monarch. There are a few reasons for this. Firstly, this was partly due to the realization that they needed a united and strong military after the chaos of the religious wars. But more importantly, they were willing to recognize the absolute monarch's authority in exchange for guarantees of their own social status. In a time when their social status was waning and being challenged by a rising middle class, this was very appealing. Therefore, absolute monarchs were able to woo the nobles into loyal subordination by giving them legal and social privileges, such as large estates, more noble titles, legal exemptions from taxes or other regulations, and special places in the king's court. In exchange for this guarantee of noble lifestyle, the nobles happily relinquished any political voice they had left, and absolute monarchs could rule without any interference from their legislative bodies. The relationship between ruler and nobles was a bit unique in Eastern Europe, given that Eastern Europe still had serfdom and almost no middle class. Monarchs there had less to work with. Therefore, in exchange for recognition of their absolute power, monarchs gave Eastern European nobles complete authority over their land and serfs. Nobles there wound up with much more local autonomy, but in turn no longer challenged the dynasty in power. Finally, the nobles were defeated, for now. So on to the second characteristic of absolute rule, which is state-driven economic policy. Absolute states needed to find new sources of revenue, mostly for a single reason, which was to build and maintain a professional standing army that would maintain order at home, guarding against noble threats, for example, and pursue dynastic interests internationally. This would force monarchs to expand the reach of the state within their borders to draw more money from within the economy through taxation of subjects. The policy absolute monarchs pursued was called mercantilism, which can be defined as a government-regulated economic system in which a favorable balance of trade is achieved by controlling commercialization, colonization, and implementing protectionism. A favorable balance of trade is obviously one in which profits exceed spending or exports exceed imports. And protectionism is a policy that taxes imports in order to discourage their purchase, instead creating an artificial draw to purchasing locally made stuff. Here's a pretty simple infographic that encapsulates what is mercantilism. So typical mercantilist methods of increasing state revenue include things like promoting the growth of local manufacturing or shipping, acquiring colonies to produce cash crops for your domestic market, or controlling trade networks to ship those goods. Of course, straight up taxing your subjects more is a cornerstone of this policy. While Renaissance governments had previously funded voyages of exploration and colonized, mercantilist policies represent a new degree of state control over a national economy and the economic lives of their average subjects. As mentioned, a key reason for this policy was the need to maintain a large standing army, and military costs were by far the largest cost of the absolute state. Just look at the size of these militaries over time. Those soldiers needed to be trained, clothed, and armed in order to do their jobs. In peacetime, military spending was about 50% of the state budgets in absolute states, but in times of war they shot up to 80%. Of course, these wars were no longer fought in the name of religion, but simply justified by their benefit to state power. And we'll be looking at a few of those wars throughout this unit. All right, on to the third characteristic of the absolute state, which is religious policy. Like the first characteristic, this is in many ways a continuity with the state-building techniques of new monarchs, who wanted to control the church in their territories. And this led to the creation of national churches, just like how the Concordat of Bologna created a French national church even before the Reformation. Obviously, states that had adopted Protestantism had already gotten rid of this problem. But for France and Austria in particular, the church is still around. Having been defeated as a political force, the Catholic Church now found that it was actually beneficial to support this sacred image of the divine right monarch, because in turn, those monarchs would support the Catholic faith and persecute non-Catholics. France and Austria further achieved a political victory over the church by kicking out papal inquisitions, taking over monastic lands, and placing state authority over church authority on topics like marriage and education. Catholicism was still a dynamic cultural force in Europe, but no longer an independent political force. So on to the very last characteristic of the absolute state then. This one also has some continuities with previous government practices, but never before had the funding of culture, the arts, and the sciences been such an explicit state policy. Absolute monarchs found that doing so was all very good propaganda for their rule, or what we might call a form of soft power. Monarchs sought to glorify themselves and their states by sponsoring new forms of art that often made a city into a museum of state power. Baroque and neoclassical architecture were important ways to communicate that power to the public. In addition to publishing plays and sponsoring traveling arts like ballet and theater. Perhaps the most famous result of these projects is the building of great royal palaces. Louis XIV's Versailles and the Austrian Habsburg Schönbrunn palaces are two ideal examples, which we're going to look at in detail during the unit. But a new type of cultural sponsorship took form under absolute monarchs as well, and that would be the funding of new scientific discoveries and royal academies of science, like we see here. These are three images of Louis XIV of France visiting the Royal Academy of Science to encourage scientific discovery. So states were competing for international prestige by the number of scientific discoveries they made in astronomy, medicine, or botany, and in doing so they accelerated a scientific revolution that was already underway since the Renaissance. In many ways, scientific discovery supported the idea that these new monarchs controlled the world by understanding nature. It was a further way that they competed with the authority of the church in ownership over truth. Some of these characteristics and techniques of state building were not limited to places that became ruled by absolute monarchs. Another answer to the problem of the age of religious wars was also proposed, and that's constitutionalism. This was a theory of government adopted in England as well as the Dutch Republic. Constitutionalism, like secular absolutism, is a social contract political theory. However, in this contract between ruler and ruled, the natural rights of the ruled are protected by law or a constitution. In exchange for those protections of rights, the ruled acknowledge the power of government to govern on their behalf. And the most famous political thinker behind constitutionalism at the time is John Locke. And in John Locke's second treatise of civil government, he writes, "For no government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it, which they can never be supposed to do till either they are put in a full state of liberty to choose their government and governors, or at least till they have such standing laws to which they have by themselves or their representatives given their free consent." This is obviously a much more familiar type of government to us who live under a constitution that protects our rights. How that came to be will be a major focus at the end of our unit. But like absolute monarchies, England and the Netherlands practiced mercantilism and encouraged the arts and the sciences. In fact, they became the richest and most scientifically advanced places in Europe. So we've now previewed all the relative topics to this unit. Hopefully you could contextualize any LEQ prompts on absolutism or constitutionalism in the previous age of religious wars, in particular the 30 Years' War. And that's where we're going to begin the unit this week. So see you then.